Certainly good to see everybody tonight. If you would, turn to Judges chapter 3. Probably make it fairly easy for you tonight, and we'll spend most of our time here in the account that we find in Judges chapter 3. I'll look mainly at a story that we find here about Ehud, and we'll talk through a little bit of the background that leads us up to that story. The story itself that I think is fairly pretty interesting, at least in my mind. And then, as we conclude, some of the lessons that hopefully we can take from the things that we find here. So as far as background and where we are as we look at Judges chapter 3, we're probably coming up to the end of probably what Brandon's gonna finish up as he handles the study that he's done on Exodus. I'm guessing where he might end that, and thinking this is probably soon after that study might end. We'll see. Hopefully it keeps going. I'm good with that. But this is kind of following the children of Israel going into the promised land. We can see in Judges chapter 2 that Joshua has passed away, that generation has passed away, and they start to turn away from God. And we see that kind of story of them turning to God, and then turning away from God, and kind of this back and forth that we see with the children of Israel. And we'll see some of that in the study tonight. But that's kind of time-wise where we are when we look at Judges chapter 3. We'll start in verse number 5 and read a few verses and have comments. But we'll eventually go through basically the remainder of this chapter to kind of talk through this story of mainly Ehud. But in chapter 3 of Judges, and starting in verse 5, it says, "And the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, Hittites, and Amorites, and Perizzites, and Hivites, and Jebusites. And they took their daughters to be their wives, and gave their daughters to their sons, and served their gods." And so we can see that those that were around them started to have influence. They started to intermarry. And it says here that the influence that they had obviously wasn't good. It says they started to serve their gods instead of serving the true God. So we can see that influence over the children of Israel start to happen there in Judges chapter 3. And then it says in Judges chapter 3 and verse 6. And then in verse 7 it says, "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgat the Lord their God, and served Balaam and the groves." And you can see the influence that these people had. This is, again, one of the places where we see it described as they did evil in the sight of the Lord. And we can see that kind of phrase many times throughout the history of the children of Israel. And just like in other circumstances and other instances, there were consequences to this. And we can read that as we keep going. In Judges chapter 3 and verse 8 it says, "Therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the children of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years." I'm sure I botched that name, but they had this instance where they were under the king of Mesopotamia for 8 years, and so it wasn't some short time. There were consequences for them turning away from God, and it says there the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. But then we see them kind of do this yo-yo. And in verse number 9 it says, "And when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised up a deliverer to the children of Israel, who delivered them, even Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother." And we see here that Caleb's younger brother, Othniel, is going to help deliver them. They'd gone through this 8 years of being under this king of Mesopotamia, and they cried unto the Lord and turned to him, and he's going to deliver them. And in verse 10 it says, "And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel and went out to war, and the Lord delivered Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed against Cushan-Rishathaim." And so we can see that Othniel was successful in delivering him from this king of Mesopotamia. And then it says, "And the land had rest for 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died." And so we can see that there was rest, there was peace for this 40 years after they were delivered. But as we see in so many cases and so many instances throughout the Bible, when this leader died, that this Othniel passes away, things start to change, and we can see that happen many times in kind of the history. And we see that in verse 12 when it says, again, and the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. So here again, they turned to evil, and there would be, again, some consequences as Eglon is raised up against them. In verse 13 it says, and he gathered unto him the children of Ammon and Amalek, and went and smote Israel, and possessed the city of palm trees, which is thought to be the city of Jericho. It says, so the children of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. And so we see again this pattern repeating itself as there's consequences as they turn away from God. You know, sometimes we read this, at least I do, I don't know about you, read this and it's like, oh yeah, they've turned away, here's 8 years, here's 18 years. This is significant, amount of time. We read about this time frame in half a chapter, I guess, here in Judges chapter 3, but these weren't insignificant chunks of time, and we can see in other places that as the children of Israel turned away, there was other times when it was even longer periods of time. But you might think of being punished. I think of my kids that get in trouble and they're punished for a day or two, and that's not what was happening here. God had turned them over to these other leaders or countries for a significant amount of time. But then again, we see in verse number 15, it says, but when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised them up a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, a man left-handed, and by him the children of Israel sent a present unto Eglon, the king of Moab. And so here we're introduced to the person I want to talk about a bit tonight. Ehud, he's of the tribe of Benjamin. Makes an interesting comment here about him being left-handed. It seems like a strange bit of detail to be included here, but we'll get to that and we'll see how that might be important. It wasn't a common thing in the Bible to reference somebody being left-handed. They do talk about it again in Judges chapter 20 and verses 15 and 16. It talks about the children of Benjamin again. It says there in verse 15 of Judges chapter 20, it says, and the children of Benjamin were numbered at that time out of the cities 26,000 men that drew sword, beside the inhabitants of Gibeah, which were numbered 700 chosen men. And then in verse 16 it says, among all this people there were 700 chosen men left-handed. Every one could sling stones at an hair's breadth and not miss. So apparently they're pretty talented left-handers, I guess. You think about baseball and pitchers, you always wanted to have a left-handed pitcher, and it seemed to be more successful, but they had some lefties, I guess, that were pretty successful in this case. But it's something that's pretty rare to be talked about in the Bible, but it makes this reference that he's left-handed in this particular case. And then, like I said, Eglon is in power. It says here that Ehud had a present for Eglon. And in verse 16, it continues, it says, but Ehud made him a dagger, which had 2 sides of a cubit length, and he did gird it under his raiment upon his right thigh. I have a hard time sometimes kind of visualizing a dagger. I was thinking through, okay, how do you describe that? But as it says, it's different than a knife. It's got 2 edges that are sharp. It's really, really sharp at the point. It's something that you're not using to necessarily cut, but you're using to stab. And that's the visual, I guess, of this dagger that kind of comes into play here in a bit. It says he girded under his raiment. He was able to hide it under his clothes upon his right thigh. And so if you think about being left-handed, he was able to reach over to his right thigh and grab it, which would probably be the opposite of most people in that day, where they would carry things on the left side. It says it's a cubit in length. I was trying to remember. I know we have lots of places in the Bible that talks about a cubit, but as a reminder, it's kind of the elbow to the end of your middle finger is kind of that length. So if you try to imagine how long that dagger is, about 18 inches. Just out of curiosity, I grabbed a yardstick to see how long that was, and it was exactly 18 inches for me. I don't know if that plays out for you guys. Y'all can go home and measure. But that's how long of a dagger he had that he was looking to hide under his clothes. So he had he had gotten that, and like I said, he was going to use that and carry it and hide it. In verse 17, it says, "And he brought the present unto Eglon, king of Moab, and Eglon was a very fat man." Another interesting detail that you hear in this particular verse. I don't know if other places in the Bible we see this, but he's described as a very fat man, this king here in this particular account. No one's going to be talking about me in 3,000 years, but hopefully the one adjective they don't use is he's a fat man. But that's the situation King Eglon is in. They don't describe him too much. We don't know a whole lot, at least from this account, and that's one of the details that's there. And again, that actually becomes a part of the story here as well. Verse 18, it says, "And when he had made an end to offer the present, he sent away the people that bear the present." So Ehud had come with this present. He had people with him. And once they had done taking care of that, he sent them away. He let those that were with him go away, so they weren't with him anymore. And then in verse 19 it says, "But he himself turned again from the quarries that were by Gilgal, and said, I have a secret errand unto thee, O king, who said, Keep silence. And all that stood by him went out from him." And so it says he kind of got to the quarries, I guess it was, and he turned around. Those are thought to be temples or graven images. Apparently this word is translated a couple different ways, but most likely these graven images that the Moabites had built up. So he had gotten to that point, but he turned around by himself to go back to the king. And once he gets there, he tells the king he has a secret errand, as it said here, or a message for him. And I think the New King James Version translates that as a secret message, which makes a lot of sense. The king sends his people away, his servants and people that are around him. He sends those away so that they wouldn't be there to hear whatever this secret was. If you think about what had happened here, Ehud had been there. He had gone and brought this present. When he came back and he said, "Hey, I've got something to tell you," I'm guessing the king wasn't too worried. I mean, he had been there already once and probably had his guard down, if you will. And so he was able to, he was willing to send his people that are around him, his servants or his guards, whatever they were, away. And he had this discussion with Ehud in private. In verse number 20, we can see what happens there, where it says, "And Ehud came unto him, and he was sitting in a summer parlor, which he had for himself alone. And Ehud said, I have a message from God unto thee. And he arose out of his seat. And Ehud put forth his left hand and took the dagger from his right thigh and thrust it into his belly." And so again, maybe the significance here of being left-handed is, most being right-handed, they probably would carry their weapons on their left. And it's thought that perhaps these guards and other people weren't really looking for weapons where he was carrying it. And so he was able to successfully hide it and then probably caught the king by surprise as well. In verse 22, it says, "And the haft also went in after the blade, and the fat," again, kind of the details comes out here, "and the fat closed upon the blade so that he could not draw the dagger out of his belly, and the dirt came out." And so here we see that detail about this king being a fat man. And so he stabbed him, and it says the haft or the handle went all the way into his body, and he couldn't even pull it out. It was stuck there, as it says, the fat closed upon it. And so he had stabbed this king, and it plunged into his body. It says that his dirt came out, kind of like, what does that mean? But it's pretty graphic, I guess. It says basically his insides come out. So a graphic kind of description of what plays out in this situation with this king. Verse 23, it says, "Then Ehud went forth through the porch and shut the doors of the parlor upon him and locked them." So he left. He took off after doing this, and he locked the doors basically behind him. And in verse 24 it says, "When he had gone out, his servants came, and when they saw that, behold, the doors of the parlor were locked. They said, Surely he covereth his feet in his summer chamber." So these servants came back to check on this king, and the door was locked, and they're like, well, it says here he surely covereth his feet, which from my understanding means he was taking a nap. That was kind of what it referred to there. I should have covered my feet this afternoon, but I didn't have a nap. But that was what they assumed he was doing. He was covering his feet or having a nap or asleep, and so they left him alone until it till a certain amount of time passed, and they started to get worried. In verse 25 it says, "And they tarried till they were ashamed, and behold, he opened not the doors of the parlor," speaking of the king. "And he said, Therefore they took a key and opened them, and behold, their Lord was fallen dead on the earth." And so they had waited, they'd gotten concerned, just as they might after a certain amount of time has passed, and they went in with a key and found him there. Verse 26 says, "And Ehud escaped while they tarried, and passed beyond the quarries, and escaped unto Serath." And so he escaped away. He had kind of bought himself some time by locking the door, if you will, and he had escaped. But it didn't stop there. Ehud continued to take action. In verse 27 it says, "And it came to pass when he was come that he blew a trumpet in the mountain of Ephraim, and the children of Israel went down with him from the mount, and he before them. And he said unto them, Follow after me, for the Lord hath delivered your enemies the Moabites into your hand. And they went down after him, and took fords of Jordan toward Moab, or took the fords of Jordan toward Moab, and suffered not a man to pass over." So basically they blocked the places where they could cross over Jordan to go get help or to get away, so the Moabites couldn't get away. And in verse 29 it says, "And they slew of Moab at that time about 10,000 men, all lusty and all men of valor, and there escaped not a man. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 80 years." So 80 years of rest followed this. I think of 80. I think of Abraham Lincoln every time, I guess, when I read it. But 80 years or 80 years, they had this rest. And so, I don't know about you, it's a pretty colorful story. It's got a lot of details. I can kind of close my eyes and have a vision of what happened here. It's probably completely different than reality, but it's interesting how much detail is captured here. And like I said, it's interesting looking back and reading this kind of details about this story that happened over 3,000 years ago, really, and we have that kind of information in the Bible. It's pretty amazing. So what can we maybe take from these? There's a couple of things that happen that maybe we can learn from in this story, some things that we can do in our life, I think. And so we'll talk through a couple of those. This is not a lesson, though, on how to assassinate anybody, although this could be taken from this story, I suppose, but that's not something we want to take and emulate. But we do see some things that maybe we can be reminded of, and we'll go through these pretty quickly. One is the importance of keeping the right company. You know, it talks about them being intermingled and marrying those that were around them. They were not supposed to do that. They were influenced by them. They started to turn away from God, and we can see some of the repercussions. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33, verse that we read pretty often, it says, "Be not deceived, evil communications or evil companionship corrupt good manners." And so these guys got kind of intermingled with those that influenced them to do things that were wrong, right? And we should look to avoid those situations in our lives. We need to avoid being around the wrong people and let them influence us. We need to try to do the opposite, right? We need to have a good influence on those that are around us. We need to be a positive influence in their life instead of the other way around. You know, it talks about God's deliverance. You know, it talks about how God was willing to deliver them when they cried out to them and wanted to turn back to God, and God was able to hear them and respond. In Psalm 34, verse number 17, says, "The righteous cry, and the Lord heareth, and delivereth them out of all their troubles." You know, God heard their cries. He listened to them. He saw that they were turning back to Him, and He responded. In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, Philippians 4 and verse 6 talks to us today about prayer. It says, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God." You know, God heard His people. He heard Him turning to Him, and He hears us today. He can help us. He can deliver us. He can help us through trouble. He can help us through hard times, and we have an awesome ability to go to Him in prayer in order to get that help. So He hears our cries as well. You know, we can learn to use our abilities, you know, whatever they might be. You know, being left-handed in this case was unique for Ehud, and he used that, I guess, to his advantage. We all have some unique ability, some unique skill, maybe something that we can do, maybe perhaps a little bit different or better than others that might be around us. We've all been given talents. God tells us we have talents in our life, and we need to make sure that we recognize whatever those strengths are and use them for the betterment of God's kingdom. It may be the ability to connect with somebody and invite somebody to the service. It may be the ability to lead a song. It may be the ability to, sit down one-on-one with somebody and teach them God's word. It may be coordinating some event. I know some of the ladies help coordinate, helping out the homeless shelter. There's tons of things that we can do in our life if we can recognize the abilities, whatever they are that we have. Some of them may not be as obvious, but we need to ask ourselves, what's my ability? What are the talents that I have, and how can we use those to serve God? And I encourage us all to take a look and to look for places that we can be helpful to God's kingdom. Ehud had courage. He turned around by himself and went into the king's home and carried this out. We think it takes some courage to do that. We as Christians are asked to have courage. We're encouraged to have courage as we serve God. Joshua chapter 1 and verse 9 talks about this. Joshua chapter 1 and verse 9, where it says, "Have not I commanded thee, be strong and of a good courage, be not afraid, neither be dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest." We may not think today we need the same kind of courage. Maybe we're not physically in danger the same way that maybe he would have felt physically in danger, but it may not be that far off. You look at some of the things going on in the world. You look at reports from India, for example, and there's persecution that'll go on even today to Christians and to people that are looking to God's will. And so we need to be prepared and have courage. And sometimes here we may have to have a different kind of courage, right? We may have to have the courage to be different, to stand out in the crowd, to be a Christian. Sometimes that takes a little bit of courage to be strange, if you will, from the world's point of view. We may have to have the courage to give something up that is in our way in serving Him. We may need to give up some kind of material thing. We may have to have the courage to put Jesus in front of friends or family. And so there's things that we need to do and be courageous enough to be different and to serve God in our lives. Another thing that I noticed from this story as I read through it is, Ehud had obstacles, he had things that he had to do, but he kind of planned to make all this happen. He made a weapon, he planned to conceal it, he used his ability to his advantage, being left-handed. He came to the king that first time, and perhaps he built some trust with him. He shared that he had this secret to get alone, to be alone with the king. He locked the door to give himself time. He was ready to lead others afterwards and against the Moabites. He was prepared. He had done some planning. I don't know about you. I feel like sometimes in my life I just kind of go through it willy-nilly and just react to whatever happens. But there's probably some things that we could do to plan to be successful. Plan to get more knowledge of the Scriptures. We as parents need to plan to bring our children up and lead them to service to God. Can plan to make our congregations successful. We can plan to share the gospel with others. There's lots of things that we can make plans to do in order to be helpful in God's kingdom. And so we can work to have a plan in that space instead of, like I said, sometimes I feel like I'm just going through things and not planning ahead of time, just reacting instead. And of course, God gives us a plan. God gives us guidance that we need to follow. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16 and 17. 2 Timothy chapter 3 verses 16 and 17 said, "All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works." We can look to God's word. We can use it in our life, and we can use it as our guide, and that's really our plan that we need our guide to put these plans together. The other thing I noticed in a couple places in this this story and what leads up to it is leadership matters. Leadership matters. It's many times, the children of Israel seem to thrive under some leadership, and that person passes away, and eventually you hear that they've turned away from God. And so you can see that's something that plays itself out. We've talked about leadership here with this congregation. The other place that I see, unfortunately, that we need probably in this country more leadership is within our families. And we as fathers and even mothers, we need to be leaders to our children and make sure that we're present and being the right kind of example to our families. And that's one thing that seems to be missing a lot of times in this country especially. And it's important, and leadership's important in this case. And we can see that through Ehud and what he does, as well as the other places where there's leadership or lack of leadership, and the children of Israel fall away. And finally, there's consequences. There's consequences to turning away from God. For us, there's consequences for forgetting Him. There's consequences to sin if we don't take care of it. In James chapter 1 and verse 15, it says, "And when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death." And so there's consequences. Romans chapter 6 and 23 talks about the wages of sin is death. Just like there were consequences when the children of Israel turned away from God, there's consequences for us if we don't deal with the sin problem that we have. Luckily, again, God has given us a plan to take care of that we can turn to Him, we can believe, confess, repent, and be baptized, and have those sins taken care of. And we have the ability to do that, and that's a great blessing that we have here in this life. He's given us a plan to take care of that so that we can avoid the consequences that were rightly coming towards us as we have sin in our life. Again, just a few of the things that I find as I look at this story, again, just beyond the fact that it's an interesting story to me, perhaps a few thoughts that we can take from it. Some people think the Bible's sometimes dull or boring. I mean, there's stories like this that I read, and it's like, this is pretty interesting stuff that we can find, and it's not by itself. There's tons of things that we can find in the Bible that are not only interesting and colorful, but things that hopefully can help us and lead us in the right direction. And this is one of those stories, and one of many. I encourage you to continue to study this and other parts of the Bible that can be helpful, obviously. So these are all the things that I had. Hopefully interesting, hopefully helpful, hopefully encourage you to study more as you go forward. We never know the minds of those that are here. If you're in need of obeying the gospel and be added to the kingdom, we certainly invite you to do that tonight and to be baptized. Or if there's one that needs the prayers of the church, we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation.